Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the acid ball python. The acid is a pretty new morph. You may not have heard of it. It's only been on the market for about 5 years, and it was first proven genetic by J. Royals Reptiles down in Orlando, Florida. And it kind of is an interesting story behind it. They didn't actually produce the first one. They were actually looking for dinker projects, unusual looking normals that they could discover new genes and bring them to the market. And that is how the acid was born. They found this snake, and from what I've heard, they picked it up for almost nothing. You know, sometimes it's a risk going into dinker projects because you see a little bit of something in a normal looking snake. Maybe you pay a little bit more for it, but you don't really know if it's genetic or not until you start breeding it through some of your other combos. And kind of the downside of working with dinkers, sometimes you can pick up a normal and then you breed it with another normal. Come to find out it's not genetic and you end up with a whole bunch of normals which aren't worth very much. So let me tell you, working on the kind of the bottom end of the dinker projects, trying to bring new genes to the market, I'd say it's a little bit hard, and sometimes you don't make a lot of money, but sometimes you can find something spectacular like the acid. And in this video I want to jump over to the internet and I want to show you what the acid looks like and some of the amazing potential of this brand new ball python gene. Alright, so I want to jump back and forth between the world of ball pythons and morph market, and this is what an acid looks like. And I would say at first glance there's really only one morph that looks close to this, and that is the leopard. The leopard's kind of interesting. I would really consider the leopard the king of combos because it really jumbles up the patterns on a lot of snakes when you add leopard to it, but it doesn't really change the base color, which is really the strength of the leopard. I would say the acid is probably like a leopard on steroids. It jumbles up the patterns even more than the leopard. And the interesting thing I find about the acid is that sometimes it'll darken the base colors and sometimes it won't really darken them. Usually if you have like a dark morph that darkens the base color of the snake, every single combo that you mix it in with, it'll darken it significantly. And the cool thing about the acid is I find it really changes depending on what morph you're mixing it with. Sometimes it darkens it a lot, sometimes it doesn't darken it hardly at all, which is really the strength of the acid. And the thing that really struck me is if you look at the top of the snake, it really looks like a leopard, but take a look at this. This is the bottom of the snake. And let me tell you, all these acids and acid combos have this crazy pattern on the belly. Normally you don't see crazy patterns like this on any ball python morph. This is really unusual for any morph to actually have a really crazy pattern like this. So I would think it'd be really easy to separate your acids from everything else by looking at the belly of the snake. It's kind of an unusual characteristic for a ball python morph. So here is the pinstripe. You know, the pinstripe's one of my favorite genes. It's a dominant morph, so anything you breed a pinstripe to, 50% of the offspring come out pinstripes or pinstripe combos. And the thing I really like about it is it has this really bright gold color to it. Probably the brightest gold snake that you can find in ball pythons. And the one thing I really don't like about a lot of genes when you mix it with pinstripe is that you actually lose a lot of the gold color on the pinstripe, kind of detracts from it. But that is not the case for the acid. Take a look at this, and if you take a look at just the base pinstripe, you can see there's just little lines coming down the side, and it's a little line here. It's got a very characteristic pattern on the snake. Here's what happens when you mix it with the acid. Totally just explodes. The pattern looks completely different in the pattern, but it really keeps the gold color, which I really like with the pinstripe. And if we keep adding stuff to the pinstripe, this is actually a spot nose pinstripe. So if you take the spot nose gene, mix it with pinstripe, you can't really tell there's much of a difference when you mix spot nose, but if you layer the acid on top of it, take a look at this crazy snake. That is the most amazing pinstripe that I've ever seen. This is actually the acid pinstripe spot nose. Quite an amazing combination. And I pulled up another one that's even more insane. Take a look at this one. This is really crazy. This is the acid calico Dragonfly, which is a whole bunch of different genes. This is actually the Pastel pinstripe, which the Pastel pinstripe is the lemon blast that we started with. Well, we actually started with the pinstripe. We add the Pastel on top of it, you get the lemon blast. And this actually adds the calico, acid, and fire. It's a 5-gene combo. Looks pretty amazing when you start layering stuff on top of it. It seems like everything, you know, with the pinstripe combos, you always get this almost like a freckled pattern, and it really, in a lot of cases, it really keeps kind of a goldish yellow color, which is pretty awesome. Here is a super pastel, and if you've been breeding for a while, you've probably seen super pastels. You know, pastel is like the bread and butter. You have 2 copies of the gene, and you produce a super pastel, which kind of has highlights down the back. A lot of times it has kind of a washed out head, brings out a lot of the yellow in the snake. Here's what happens when you add acid on top of a super pastel. This is really interesting. You actually look if you're kind of looking at the highlights, they're almost all completely gone down the back. You can see it's really enhancing the background color, really shatters up the pattern, just kind of makes the pattern explode, and keeps the white head. You can almost tell the super pastel's in there because of the faded out head. That is a pretty amazing combo. Here's another one that's kind of unusual. You know, most ivories, ivory is a super yellow belly, which is an all white snake with black eyes. I'd say it's a little bit dirtier of a white snake. It's not like a really bright white as in your blue-eyed leucistics or superfires. This happens to be kind of an unusual example of a really bright white ivory. Sometimes the head's a little bit discolored on these ivories. And usually when you mix genes with ivories, you end up with a white snake. So a lot of times, even if you added like pinstripe or pastel in an ivory, it's pretty much masked. And a lot of people will say this is an ivory possible, pinstripe possible, whatever, because you can't really see in most cases that it's coming through. And I thought this was really interesting. This is mixing the acid in with the ivory. It's probably the first combo that I've really seen anything really pop out of an ivory by adding in the acid. It's pretty amazing. This is a really beautiful snake. It has this really unusual bright yellow line right down the top of the snake. Really awesome combo. Here's another one. The spider is, you know, it's kind of controversial because some spiders have head wobbles. Not a lot of people breed them. I breed them on a limited scale here in my collection. I just had 1 spider pairing last year. Got another spider pairing this year. I'm actually doing I actually have some visual desert ghosts with the spider in. Pretty amazing morph. If it wasn't for the head wobble and some of the neurological issues, a lot of people shy away from them. But I'd say as far as the spider's concerned, it's probably one of the most visually stunning snakes in all of ball pythons. It's probably one of the most beautiful standalone morphs, and it's very visually dominant. So you add things to spider, and sometimes the spider just really dominates. Here's what happens when you add the acid to the spider. You can definitely tell on this one, it's kind of unusual because it seems like it almost is bringing out more of the yellows instead of darkening the snake like a lot of other ones are darkened. Almost seems like it lightens it and then has a little bit of darkening maybe on the side. You can definitely tell the pattern is really jumbled up for a spider. Almost has this completely clear line right down the back, which you never see in spiders. If you go back to the spider and kind of look at it, usually it has kind of the spider web pattern right down the middle of the back. So I'd say it's really unusual that anything really affects the spider like the acid. Here's another one. This is just a straight pastel, and you know, there's different versions of pastels. Some of them are brighter than others. Some of them have a jumbled up pattern more than others. Some of them are really subdued. And a pastel, essentially what it does is a lot of times it'll reduce the pattern a little bit or jumble it up just a little. And normally you'll see a lot of the yellow coming out. That's kind of what we consider a really good pastel, is a really bright yellow snake. This is what happens when we add acid to pastel. Look at this one. This is probably one of the most amazing pastels that I've ever seen. Just a crazy looking snake. I've really never seen anything that acts quite like the acid with a lot of these combos. It kind of brings a whole new dimension to ball pythons. Here's another one. This is, believe it or not, this is a spider with super pastel on top of it. Kind of an unusual combo. I haven't seen a whole lot of these. This is called a killer bee because the killer, usually if it's super pastel, we say it's killer, and then the bee stands for spider. So this is what a killer bee looks like, super pastel spider. This is what happens when we layer on acid on top of it. You can see it almost keeps the same color, but it really just kind of just really breaks up the pattern. Makes for a really crazy pattern on the snake, and it's kind of interesting. Sometimes it lightens and sometimes it darkens, and in this case it almost is kind of a neutral color where it's allowing most of the, if you actually go back to, well, I'd say it's kind of hard because, you know, the exposures of the pictures and the different lines of pastel, it's almost hard to compare one pastel to another because there's so many subtle variations. But you can see in this one it's kind of a really light washed out color, and you come over here and it has a little bit more yellow, almost like it's intensifying the color instead of darkening it. So here's a case where it really darkens the gene, really makes it for a good combination when it darkens too. This is actually called the black magic. It's kind of a slang. If you actually wonder what genes this is actually a Mojave and a black pastel, both in the same snake. It's pretty dark, and usually with a Mojave you have these little keyhole patterns in here, and you can definitely tell it's slightly dark, but this is what happens when you add acid on top of the black magic. Take a look at this crazy snake. This is, they're calling this one the sorcery. What kind of sorcery is in this snake? That is amazing. I can't even believe it. So as a matter of fact, I was looking at some of these prices. If you want to get into the project, I'd say they start about $1,000, which isn't too bad for a new gene, which is pretty amazing actually. This one's actually sold for $8,000. Still some pretty good money in some of these snakes. It's pretty amazing. I can't say I've ever seen anything really affect a lot of these genes in such different ways than a lot of morphs. It really stands out, really mixes well with a lot of stuff. So here's the last one I want to show you. This is a lesser, and it's kind of interesting how it works with the lesser. The thing I like about the lesser is I actually have quite a few of them. They're in the blue-eyed leucistic. You breed two of them together and you get an all-white snake with blue eyes. Probably everybody's favorite snake with those blue eyes. And the thing I like about the lesser is it has bright yellow and a lot of contrast. Looks really awesome. This is what happens when you mix acid with lesser. It's pretty amazing. It actually reduces some of the pattern, and in this case you can definitely see it darkens the snake overall. If someone handed me the snake, I'd be hard pressed to say that there was lesser in there. Pretty amazing combo with the acid and the lesser. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And James Porter asks, how much substrate do I use in my ball python tubs? And that is a very good question. I actually use a Pro Coco coconut husk chip substrate in all my tubs. And as far as the levels in my tubs, what I do is I bring all the substrate to the front and pretty much keep the back over the hot spot completely clear so the ball python can sit directly on the hot spot. And as far as up front, I'd say I probably bring it up about halfway up the deli cup. If you bring it up a little bit higher, what actually happens is the snake will push all the substrate into the water, and you'll end up with a deli cup full of substrate, which is not very good. Sometimes the snake can't even drink because it's all pretty much like a waterlogged substrate in the deli cup. And if you bring it down too low, then it doesn't really hold enough humidity, and I'm always chasing the tubs, trying to keep enough humidity in the tubs. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.